Good evening. Welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam 67-68, Tet survivor, stationed at Long Binh, which was 55,000 troops there when I was there in 67-68, and it got bigger after I left. Welcome to the show. We're here on a regular basis on twice a month on Wednesdays, the second and fourth Wednesdays of the month. And if you want to go back in and see some of our older shows, go to the same way you got in tonight. Just go to On Demand, and they're there. And next slide. And this is what we're trying to do with this show is we're trying to tell the real truth of Vietnam and the men and women who have served there, and to teach those who don't know anything about the Vietnam War or know a little bit about the Vietnam War. Is the reason for this show, and we're going to go into a little bit more about Ken Burns' documentary a little later on. But if you want to be a part of the show, just dial 919-518-9773, or even better, go on to Skype and type in Computers 2K Voice. That K is capital K, by the way. And so come in and be part of the show tonight. Especially want you to be part of the next show as we go into it. But tonight, if you have a question, comment, suggestion, or whatever, just come on air and tell us what you want. We're broadcasting, by the way, from the Raleigh Research Triangle area here in North Carolina. We're broadcasting from the international headquarters of Nissan Communications. Very happy to be here working with my engineer, producer, director, keeping me halfway straight, Amnon Nissan. And we couldn't do this show without him because it's his studio and so forth, and he can put anybody in my seat. So we're going to look at the next slide as we keep hearing about there's 22 veterans a day commit suicide. And it's important that if you know someone or you're watching this show and it brings some memories back that you're not happy with or you're having problems, call these people and text and press 1. There's somebody on there to be willing to talk to you and help you through any times you have. Let's stop these 22 a day veterans from taking their own lives and affecting their families and so forth. On our last show, we started this series called 60 Crazy Things, the Vietnam War. And we got a little over halfway through before we got started, but we're going to pick up tonight on number 40. We're going to be talking about who everybody thinks and knows a whole lot about, supposedly, is Ho Chi Minh. That's Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is one of the many names he used. He led the independence movement from 1941 onwards, established a communist rule in 1945. And although he officially stepped down from power in 1965, he remained a figurehead throughout the war. He didn't exactly step down. He was stepped over. Which we'll get into in a little bit on. He also served as president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from his 1945 and his death in 1969. But next slide. Ho's opposition to colonialism, which was the French that were in Vietnam for so many years, began at the age of 9 when he worked as a messenger for an anti-colonial organization. His father also introduced him to several revolutionaries. Ho went on to attend a National Academy in Hue. I know it looks like it says Who there, but it's pronounced Hue, Vietnam. He was dismissed from that academy after taking part in protests against the French in 1908. He then traveled to Southern Vietnam in 1909 and worked briefly as a school teacher. During World War I in 1914-18, Ho worked in London, England, Paris, France, and during this time, Ho's lifelong commitment to communism and Vietnamese independence began. Basically, he wanted Vietnam as one country under Vietnamese rule, and that hadn't happened in a long time. So that was what kept him going. But then he also became communist. In Paris, Ho adopted the name of Nguyen A Quoc. My pronunciation may not be the best in the world, but you can pronounce it the way you want to pronounce it because he's not going to care. Basically, it was Nguyen the Patriot. And he attracted attention when he presented a written request to the Versailles Peace Conference demanding independence from Vietnam. So even in World War I, he wanted to have Vietnam as one country. Ho became a founding member of the French Communist Party in 1920. From 1920 to 23, he was an outspoken leader of the Vietnamese community in Paris. He participated in the colonial union formed under communist sponsorship and published 2 anti-colonial journals. That was trying anything to get the French out. Ho was then invited to Moscow in Russia in 1923, where he studied at the University of Oriental Workers. In 1925, was sent to China to organize a communist movement. He formed the Thanh Nguyen Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, whose members were mostly Vietnamese students in the southern Chinese port city of Canton. The league called for independence, redistribution of land, fair taxation, and equal rights for men and women. Sounds a lot like the American Constitution and so forth. In 1927, Ho was forced to leave Canton after the Chinese government cracked down on local communists. Ho returned to South China in 1930s to unite the factions as a formal Communist Party, drawing its members from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. He continued his organizing in Hong Kong and Shanghai, but was arrested again by the British in 1931 and imprisoned for 2 years. Released in 1933, he spent the next several years in the Soviet Union. In 1940, Ho returned to South China. With most of Vietnam under Japanese occupation, he chaired a meeting of the party's Central Committee inside the Vietnamese border, marking his first return to Vietnam in 30 years. This is about the same time that he presented himself to the United States, and they went in and trained him and General Giap and the Viet Minh to fight the Japanese. We furnished him weapons. We told him how to do it, help him basically set up his own government. I think we did some of the same thing with a guy named Castro, if I remember correctly. Ho then announced the formation of the Viet Minh, the League for Vietnamese Independence, an organization demanding independence from French rule and Japanese military occupation. From 1941 to 1945, although imprisoned again in China for more than a year, Ho led in seeking support for the Viet Minh, forming alliances with American diplomats and intelligence officers in South China. Again, he was working on the alliances with the United States. He wanted the United States to help him after the end of the World War II to turn the Vietnam back over to them for independence, where the United States turn around and let the French do it. Beginning in mid-1960s, Ho Chi Minh's health declined, and he made only occasional public appearances. He never married, but he was widely viewed in North Vietnam as the father of his country and often referred to in his later years as Bác Ho, or Uncle Ho. He dressed in simple clothes. He went out and visited the villagers. He didn't want to be looking at as a tyrant or a leader. He just wanted to be a good old boy with the rest of the Vietnamese population, so they would follow him. He died of a heart attack on September 3rd, 1969, almost 6 years before the South Vietnamese government surrendered. In other words, he never saw Vietnam as one country before he died. That was a picture of his tomb. It's in Hanoi. It sits way back up off the road, and the pictures you see looks like it's right there on the street, but it sits way back up off the road to go see it. I've been by, but haven't been in. I have no reason to want to go in. Okay. Now, let's talk about this. We talked about Ho Chi Minh being the leader and so forth. As I mentioned a while ago briefly, he was more or less the figurehead of this North Vietnamese and the communist forces. He wanted to kind of plod along. Russia, who was supporting them at the time, wanted to take things slowly. China wanted to speed things up a little bit. So there was a mixture of there on the Communist Party in Hanoi, which way they were going to go. Even by 1967, America's military and intelligence and civilian leaders had no idea who really was calling the shots in Hanoi. They knew there was a Politburo group, but they didn't know who was there. They had the impression the decisions were made collectively, albeit under the general guided hands of President Ho Chi Minh. They thought he was still in charge. During the war, American intelligence experts cycled through a long list of suspects, of who was in charge. At one point or another, intelligence reports analysis of the time, all 11 members of the top communist leadership, the political bureau of, or Politburo, Bo Chin Tri, as the true leader of the Vietnamese Workers' Party. They couldn't figure out how it was, so today it was this guy, and the next day it was that guy. In fact, it was none of those guys. The leader was Le Van Nguyen, who later took the name of Le Duan, a nondescript party official from humble origins in central Vietnam. I don't know why the Vietnamese changed their names so much, because they're all hard to pronounce, unless you're Vietnamese. Largely out of sight from American intelligence, Le Duan ruled the party with an iron fist from the late 1950s until his death in 1986. No general secretary before him or after him was able to hold onto the reins of power for that long. Everybody in the Communist Party wanted to be in charge, but he was what we would call large and in charge. Yet outside of Vietnam, little is known of Le Duan. After President Nguyen Dinh and John F. Kennedy were assassinated, since an opportunity for rapid victory against a leader South, there were 8 different leaders in the South after the assassination of Dinh. All the generals at one time come up and wanted to be the leader, and then there would be another coup, and somebody else would take over, and there'd be another coup, and someone else would take over. So as I said, there was about 8 different leaders there in that year or so. Le Duan was able to corral the party leadership during that time and to go all out and win the war. In other words, he was going to follow the Chinese idea of the way it was supposed to be going. He had a daring plan he called the General Offensive and the General Uprising, known as the Vietnamese as Tong Tien Cong Viet Noi Day. Okay? Now, I just made that up as I went because I couldn't pronounce the name, but you can read up there and see what it is. By the fall of 1964, the General Secretary drew in Plan X, the final phase of his bid for victory that included an ambitious offensive aimed at Saigon. Remember this as we go on a little bit farther. Sending in heavily armed commando units to hold down key targets. Revolutionary troops stationed throughout the capital would incite the people to rise up and seize power with a fallen puppet regime. Now, this was the same time that the death of Kennedy, Johnson was taking over. There was no real government in South Vietnam per se. So while all this was going on, his idea was to go out there and strike while the stick was hot and do all this thing. But then the sudden influx of American combat troops in 1965 put a real crimp in Le Duan's plan for a rapid execution of Plan X. But the General Secretary persisted, convinced that reverting to a defensive guerrilla war would weaken communist morale. Le Duan ordered his men to maintain the initiative and launch big unit battles. Up until that time, most of what had been fighting in South Vietnam were the Viet Cong or the guerrilla warfare. But this is when the North Vietnamese well-trained army who had been fighting for years together were starting to get more involved. With this offensive strategy encountered major American sweeping operations in the southern countryside in 1966 and early 67. Le Duan's command of the war came under heavy criticism in Hanoi. That's when we started introducing the helicopters, not the airborne guys, but the guys coming in on a helicopter, flying in and coming in with support and so forth. Le Duan and Le Duc II, who was his deputy, controlled over Vietnam, and the war effort was suddenly at risk because they were losing a lot more men than they had anticipated, because the helicopter coming in, a number of Americans were coming in. We were no longer advisors. We were more combat troops there. So things, who they were fighting and so forth, completely changed. While American bombs fell, Le Duan and Le Duc II, his deputies, set off a fierce political battle in Hanoi. They had to fight for their own life and beliefs in 1967. The result in the largest purge of the history of the Vietnamese Communist Party. In other words, if you didn't want to go along with what he wanted to do and what he felt he should do, you kind of disappeared. And it set up what they intended to be the climatic campaign of the Vietnam War, a thing we call Tet. That's how that came about. Now let's talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was not a trail. It was a lot of trails. Some of it was just more the path through the jungle. Some of it was a paved road. It extended through North Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, back into South Vietnam, and from border to border in North and South Vietnam. It was approximately 1,000 kilometers, just over 621 miles, in some places up to 80 kilometers or 50 miles wide. Dominated by jungle, the trail consisted of a number of parts which included thousands of trails as well as dummy routes, which were used for sole purpose of confusing Americans. They had some trails that nobody ever went up and down. Then they had the regular trails. The communists conscripted villages along the way, and their job was to live close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When we bombed them, the trails and so forth, before the bombers even landed back in wherever they were coming from, those people were out there raking and shoveling and putting the Ho Chi Minh Trail back for the North Vietnamese to get their supplies and so forth, the troops down in the south. That, by the way, was 42 of our 60. Now, 43. Everybody, I hope all of you out there know what a slinky is, that toy that you can put up and it kind of walks itself down the stairs. I remember playing with one when I was a kid. But they also will come in, you know, I heard a long time ago that inventions or science was the mother of need, and sometimes you needed that radio antenna. Now you think about it, if you're out there in the jungles and people are shooting at you, the last thing you wanted, that long, tall antenna sticking up over your head. It's like, here I am, come shoot me. So slinkies were used by some in the war as mobile radio antennas. They would sling slinkies over branches and extend the range of their radios. So mother invention right there, the slinky. Now, 44, the Congressional Medal of Honor winner, Peter Lemon, was high, reported to be on marijuana when he single-handedly fought off 2 waves of Viet Cong troops and dragged a wounded soldier to safety. It's a good thing he was high, or he might have retreated. But which, you look at that, it's kind of hard to convince people that drugs were not always a problem over there. When I was there in 67, 68, there wasn't that much problems. It was later on in the 1970s and range there, it got a little bit worse. During the Vietnam War, the United States military produced recordings of ghostly voices and eerie sounds to play to the Viet Cong, who believed that if a body wasn't buried, the person's soul would wander on earth forever. They'd fly airplanes up high, and they'd have these sounds recorded and play them out over the loudspeakers and so forth. And if you see here, if the body wasn't buried, the person's soul would wander on the earth forever. Now, we're fighting a war that way we could tell, suppose if we win or losing, was body count. But after the battles, if there was any way possible, they would grab their fellow soldiers, the communists would, and drag them off so they could be buried properly whenever possible, so that their soul wouldn't be wandering around. So when we went out to do body counts, quite often, the bodies weren't necessarily there. During the Vietnam War, Navy SEAL teams 1 and 2 amassed a combined kill-death ratio of 200 to 1. So those stories you've been hearing about the Navy SEALs were, they were tough people and well-trained and so forth. And for every one they lost of their own, they killed 200 of the communists. Okay. Duct tape. I didn't know MacGyver was a Vietnam vet, but according to this, duct tape was used during the Vietnam War to repair helicopter rotor blades. Now, I used duct tape. I got my hands on some green duct tape, and that's how I kept the leeches out of my pants, was to green duct tape my pants, blouse them per se, to my boots so that the leeches couldn't get up, and it worked very well. During the Vietnam War, a U.S. prisoner of war was forced to do press conferences saying they were treated well. That was one of the things that the Vietnamese propaganda people were real strong on. They wanted to have the American troops, especially the pilots and so forth, to come on the air and make confessions about and how wonderful they were being treated and so forth. So they had one of our prisoners to come on the air, and he managed to convey the truth by blinking in Morse code the word torture. He kept blinking up over and said, was there something wrong with his eyes? And then somebody realized that what he was doing was Morse code. Now, that prisoner of war, his name was Jeremiah Denton. If you saw this show in the past, you might have seen Bill Schuette, who's been on our show several times, and his wife, or POWs. Well, he was Jeremiah Denton's navigator when he was shot down. And Jeremiah Denton went on to be a congressman. Jeremiah Denton, during a 1966 interview for what was supposed to be a propaganda film, blinked into cameras in Morse code. A dispatch that would alert the U.S. military to the conditions he endured, because the communists always talked about how well they were being treated. Number 49, super glue was used during the Vietnam War to slow bleeding until soldiers could get to the hospital. In other words, help close the wounds and so forth. Okay? Now, number 50, during the Vietnam War, one unconventional technique used by the United States against the Viet Cong was randomly replace their ammunition with decoy explosive ammunition, which destroyed the weapons that were fired. Now, what they would do, they wouldn't take, if they went into a cache and found a place where the communists had saved it, had kept their ammunition and so forth, what they would do is go in and open up several boxes of ammunition and put one shell into a clip. Just one shell. It may not be one shell in a box. It was bad. The idea was when the communists are out there firing and all of a sudden this bullet jams their gun, they start thinking that, hey, there's something wrong with what the materials they're giving us. The idea was to scare them and thinking all the weapons in the guns were allowed to jam. Most of the people who did that were the special forces who would sneak in, do this to the ammunition and sneak back out so that the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong would never know they were there. And part of the psychological games we played and they played during the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon is suspected of sabotaging the Paris Peace Accords. It's pretty well known out there and proof out there, but I put the word suspected just so that we wouldn't have any arguments there. He went into, he was one of the first ones to open up relations with China when he was there, but he went in and talked to the North Vietnamese communists and said, hold off, don't sign a peace treaty, wait till I become president and you get a better deal. Now, you wonder how many American men and women died waiting for him to become president, because this was before he was president. The election was going on, and Johnson never could prove it, but he did call him up and ask him, Nixon, if he had done that. 52, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos from 1964 to 1973 during the Vietnam War. That's equal to a plane load every 8 minutes for 9 years. And you got to remember, Laos was a neutral country. We were not allowed to go into Laos, but the Ho Chi Minh Trail didn't have any problems going through it, and we could drop bombs from airplanes. The thing about it was, if a pilot got shot down, we had 12 hours to get him out, and if after 12 hours we didn't get him out, we couldn't go back and get him. Now, you see these quite a bit in Vietnam now. When the planes were, by the way, number 53, U.S. troops in Vietnam employed over 5,000 war dogs. That's a lot of dogs, and they were invaluable. I wonder how many of them were able to come home after the war and we left. 54, after the Vietnam War, farmers recycled thousands of external fuel tanks from U.S. aircraft to create riverboat and canoes. See, when the planes took off, they had to fly quite large distances sometimes, so they had these extra tanks. Well, cut it down so that they would be able to maneuver better, they dropped those tanks. Well, the Vietnamese people, who are always very inventive, have taken those fuel tanks and turned them into boats to go out up and down the rivers and so forth. And like I say, the Vietnamese people can take nothing and make something out of it. 55. Now, this man is a soldier, a man is man. Roy Benedez, a United States soldier in the Vietnam War, performed possibly the most heroic 6 hours of battle any soldier ever has, when faced with over 1,000 NVA troops. Now, the NVA was the well-trained, well-supplied North Vietnamese regulars. When faced with those, he flew into a gunfight to save 112 Special Forces soldiers with only a knife. He held those guys so those 12 Special Forces guys could get out. He was shot multiple times, and they believed that he was dead. But when they were putting him, when the medic was putting him in the body bag, he spit in the medic's face to let him know he didn't want to go in that body bag. He was still alive. Now, it took the United States government 13 years to recognize what this man did and gave him the Medal of Honor. Today, Trump has given or getting ready to give out at least 2 Medal of Honors from the Vietnam War. They're going back and looking at some. They've been trying to get some for years for the men and women who served, and now they're going back and looking at some. Now, after Saigon fell, and the South Vietnamese troops were trying to evacuate South Vietnam, the soldiers were taking their uniforms off and throwing them away and trying to fill in with the people, the families and so forth there. But anybody who had access to a plane and could fly it, or a helicopter and so forth, were flying out to the American ships. Now, at the end of the war, U.S. Midway crew pushed $10 million worth of helicopters onto the sea so the Cessna full of evacuees could land on the deck. They were having so many helicopters and planes landing on the aircraft carriers, unloading people, that they didn't have room for them, so they had to start pushing them over the side to help those people get out. 57. During the Vietnam War, an estimated 125,000 Americans fled to Canada to avoid the military draft. Around half returned to the United States when President Carter, in his first day of office, granted them amnesty. In other words, these people who fled their country were given total amnesty to come back and resume their lives. The 58,000 and some names that are on the wall, how many of their names might not have been on the wall if 125,000 of those men hadn't left and gone away? How would it have affected those families? This picture is some counseling American Vietnam War invaders were getting at the anti-draft program office in Toronto in 1967. But at the same time, folks, a lot of Canadians came down and joined the American military and served honorably in Vietnam. Okay, the most listened to American in the war back then on the news was a guy by the name of Walter Cronkite. He was, whatever he said was the gospel. This is back when they first started to, instead of reporting things, they started editorializing. Was during the Vietnam War. Before, reporters all kind of told you the news, but during the Vietnam War, you kind of got what they thought and so forth. Unfortunately, we're even worse into that today. Now, there was a famous saying, Walter Cronkite spent a lot of time in Vietnam. Now, I've been told during the Tet Offensive in Hue, which was, we basically had run off the Vietnamese communists or the Viet Cong, all the cities and towns and villages and so forth of South Vietnam except Hue. Hue was the large imperial city of South Vietnam when the king was to live there. And they went in there originally trying not to blow up the city because it was an ancient city. The walls around the city was like 12 feet thick, and they tried not to go in there with heavy bombing and so forth. They thought they could get the Viet Cong out faster, but it didn't work that way. They were dug in. The ARVN troops, which the South Vietnamese troops, went in. The Marines fought quite a bit there. The Army tried to go in. But during that period of time, he reported from Hue, and I was told by some Marines, I can't tell you this is absolutely gospel, but I understand from some of my friends that were Marines, and they had no reason in particular to lie, told me that he had paid some of the Marines to shoot artillery in behind him so it looked good for the TV screen. But he changed his tune on the Vietnam War during Tet. And President Johnson, who was worried about losing faith, he didn't want to be the first president to lose the war. He didn't want to be the first president to lose the country to communism, which is one of the reasons he kept going. But the most famous quote attributed to President Johnson from "I do not seek and will not accept the nomination for my party another term." When he got up, I remember when he got up and said that he was not going to seek the nomination, he would not accept the nomination. But he also said, supposedly, if I've lost Walter Concrete, I've lost Middle America. Because when he got up, Walter Concrete got up and said, this ain't winnable. We're not really gaining the ground that we've been saying we have. He realized right then that any support he had before, any support his party had before, any support he had running for president went out the window. Walter Cronkite was then considered the most trusted man in America as I had. I have a feeling that that Walter Cronkite's speech about Tet and the Vietnam War had a lot to do with the politics of who was going to run and who wasn't going to run after that. Up until 1968, much of the American media was widely supportive of American policy, and not one newspaper suggested disengagement from Vietnam. But things would get worse. A 1965 Gallup poll showed only 28% of Americans were against the war. There were 37% in 1967, 50% in 1968, 58% in 1969. They were starting to get tired of the war. They get tired of the money spent in the war. They were getting tired of seeing the little short clips who don't really tell you anything, sometimes give you a misview of what's going on, but during their dinner time. They got tired of eating dinner with the Vietnam War going on. In 1971, Gallup stopped asking. The 1968 Tet Offense is what led Cronkite to see the war as unwinnable. Veterans of Vietnam widely attributed the success of the Communist Tet Offensive as a success for the Communists only in the media. I was there. We basically wiped out the Viet Cong, the guerrillas, as a fighting force. Yes, they were still Viet Cong after Tet, but most of those were North Vietnamese soldiers who sent down to fight as the guerrillas. The Viet Cong unit themselves were basically annihilated during Tet, which some ways I have a feeling that the communist government somewhat had that in mind. We won Tet, but lost the war there. The media they're referring to is Walter Cronkite. Yet, it's not that cut and dry in blaming the media. I've had some conversations with some, and friends of mine have had conversations with some of the media who were reporting back then, and of course they say no, they didn't have anything to do with the way the war ended and so forth. The Tet Offensive was a defining moment in public trust of the government reports of the progress of the war. So the news media came out and talked about how the Viet Cong had blew a hole in the wall in the American embassy, and they did. It talked about how they had got inside the embassy, which they didn't. They were all killed, or a couple of them were captured, but they did not get in the American embassy. The American public had no idea the VC were capable of infiltrating Allied installations the way they did. The problem with that was Tet had always was the holiday, the most important holiday of the Vietnam War for the Vietnamese, and even in North Vietnam, and everybody had kind of stepped back. So you had South Vietnamese troops who were going off to do their family thing. At the same time, Caisson was going on, which they were shelling the Marines there heavily, and President Johnson also had made the statement was he didn't want another damn Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu is where the Viet Minh overcame the French government who we were supporting and ended the French war. So he sent a lot of troops, or sending a lot of troops up around Caisson to help support those guys there. So We didn't have troops that were readily available to fight necessarily overnight and so forth. So we were kind of short, as you want to say, when it came to combat troops. As I've mentioned several times before, for one combat troop, it takes 9 support guys. And I can tell you, I was a support guy, even though I went out quite a bit with the infantry guys, and fighting a war and so forth, a little different than handling a typewriter or making sure that the luggage and all gets out. But the Americans saw was all of a sudden the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had stood up and attacked all these places. Some dummy had actually listened to their propaganda about the Tet stand down. Kind of gives you the idea maybe you shouldn't trust anything the communists say. Okay. Maybe the turn in public opinion had more to do with fatigue surrounding almost a decade of body counts and draft lotteries. You don't see, we're in a war today, but you don't see the caskets coming home anymore. You don't hear about the body counts anymore. That was a daily thing during the Vietnam War. The American public was exposed to that. Has the news been censored today, or is the news media just deciding that that's not something they want to show, to let people know that we are in a war and what's going on? Number 59, the censor war. There was a lot of things developed during the Vietnam War. In certain ways, it was a proxy war between the United States, Russia, and China. We developed weapons during the Vietnam War. The Russians were developing and testing weapons. The Chinese were developing and testing weapons, and it just happened to be we're fighting the war in Vietnam. One of the things the inventions that came up was the sensors. The Vietnam War saw the introduction of a lot of technology to the battlefield. Some of it worked and some of it did not. One type of technology that worked and that would later be developing into far more advanced devices was that of the unattended sensors. I got to remember to ask some of my Iraqi and Afghanistan friends about the sensors and so forth. Basically, the problem was how to monitor areas of points for enemy activity. Because in the jungles of Vietnam, it was hard to see from the sky. You had what we call triple canopy, means you had trees growing up, then you had trees growing up taller than them, and then you had trees growing up taller than them, so it was hard to see through them and so forth. Ideally, U.S. recon teams would watch trails, base camps, and the like for enemy activity. We talked about those on a previous show some time ago. There were LRPs and other special forces teams. However, given the remote nature of the jungles of Indochina, the finite number of troops available for use in recon, and the fact that putting troops into enemy-controlled territory often proved fatal to the troops. In other words, it's hard to take. You have to send a small group in. You can't tell a whole big group in because they can't hide. But send 3 or 4 guys in and they're surrounded by thousands of bad guys. It's just a matter of time before they get caught. So that's the reason they started looking to sensors and so forth. Okay. Sensors in Vietnam. A Vietnam-era sensor, generally known as the people sniffer, detected ammonia concentrations in air which indicated the presence of a group of people or animals. While sensitive but not selective for people, many water buffaloes became targets. In other words, if you had a herd of water buffaloes or a herd of several tigers going through, they might get bombed because whoever's looking at the sensor sees all this urine smell, the ammonia, and they send the bombers in. Nevertheless, it was considered the best sensor used by the 9th Infantry Division because, as opposed to other sensors that would give helicopter-borne troops real-time detection of the target. Initially developed by United States military intelligence by 1970. The DEW transmitter, this is what you see in your picture there, was a homing device camouflaged as dog or monkey feces for use in Vietnam. So if it looked like dog poop or monkey poop, it may not be. It may have been a sensor, which was dropped out of airplanes and so forth. Now, U.S. forces employed several types of unattended ground sensors. The idea was to Build a censoring device that would detect movement, sound, or even infrared emissions, heat from vehicle engines. In other words, during the down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Camouflage that device so it looked like a normal piece of vegetation or monkey poop. Deposit the device into an area known or suspected enemy activity, where the bad guys were. Monitor devices for activation. Take some sort of action when the sensors were activated. In other words, you could fly an airplane over an area instead of dropping bombs. You drop sensors along the trails that you thought were there. And then you had someone monitor sensors, and when you saw the sensors doing whatever that particular sensor was supposed to do, then you could send either bombers in, or you could send a helicopter full of troops to go in and attack that place. There were several types of unattended ground sensors deployed. The seismic. These sensors contain seismic detection. That is, they detected movement in the earth, similar to earthquake detectors, such as vehicles moving past or footsteps. Seismic devices required a small spike to be driven into the ground. This spike contained the sensing equipment. So if a herd of elephants went through, it could be decided it was a truck or something. Seismic device required a small spike to be driven to the ground. This spike contained the sensing element. If the ground moved, the sensing equipment moved and activated a radio transmitter that transmitted a beep, alerting to monitor the fact that something was moving near the sensor location. Okay? The acoustic. Acoustic sensors are similar to sunbuoys. They contain one or more sensitive microphones attached to a transmitter that will transmit whatever sounds they pick up. In other words, if the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese were talking going down the trail, you could pick it up through the acoustic sensors and know there were people there, which would probably work better than some of the urine ones. Infrared, these sensors are sensitive to change in ambient temperature. If a warm body, human, truck engine, water buffalo, or tiger came close to the sensor, it would sense a rise in air temperature and cause the internal radio transmitter to transmit a beep. But it couldn't tell you if it was a water buffalo, tiger, or Viet Cong. Number 60. Of the 2.7 million military personnel who served in Vietnam, only 1 of every 10 served as combat troops. 9 of those 10 supported the combat troops, such as administration, supply, and its many components: medical, transportation, mechanical, engineering, planning, logistics, and many other jobs. But any one of those 10 could very well find themselves fighting for their life, as there was no really safe place to be in Vietnam. One of my friends who's been on the show talks about he was at Long Binh, the same place I was, but he was there a couple of years after I was there, and he was in his barrack in the hooch, sleeping, and a rocket came in and blew him out of his bed, and he was paralyzed for a while. And that only had 55,000 troops when I was there. It had even more when he got there. They actually had, when he got there, they had a Chinese restaurant, they had swimming pools, miniature golf course, and it still wasn't particularly safe. The Vietnam Memorial Wall has etched in its face the names of all types of men and women and the many jobs they performed. Every name on that wall is not necessarily a combat troop that we lost. Now, I put in a couple because the wanted to give you a couple extra bonuses, kind of like a baker's dozen here. During the Ken Burns documentary that's on PBS, he alluded to Everett Alvarez Jr. as the longest-held American POW during the Vietnam War. In fact, there's 2 different parts that they show on that. And I think if you ask most Vietnam vets, who was the longest-held American POW in the Vietnam War, Alvarez is who they're going to say. Just like I thought for a long time until I read a book about the guy that was the longest. Alvarez, born December 23, 1937, is a former U.S. Navy commander who endured one of the longest periods as a prisoner of war, POW, in American military history. Alvarez was the second U.S. pilot to be downed and detained during the Vietnam War and spent over 8 years in captivity, making him the second longest held American POW after U.S. Army Colonel Floyd James Thompson. Not taking anything away from Alvarez, but Thompson is the longest held POW. And there's a story to that, which I'm going to tell you as we go along. This is Floyd J. Thompson, or James Thompson. He is the longest held POW. Now, why doesn't people know that he was the longest held? What is the story to that? Colonel Floyd James Thompson who endured nearly 9 years of torture, disease, and starvation in Vietnam, is the longest held prisoner of war in American history. His status as the longest serving POW was long unacknowledged by the military and inspired the book Glory Denied, The Saga of Jim Thompson by Tom Philpott. I recommend you get the book. It's a great read. The military affairs columnist was Philpott. The book chronicles his horrifying experiences as a prisoner and the personal miseries that befell him after his release. See, when he was captured, he talks about in his book what kept him sane as being the longest POW, the first POW in the Vietnam War. Not knowing how long it was going to last, with the communists coming in and with all the propaganda and so forth, he talks about it in his book. He had a wife and children when he was captured. What kept him going and got him through all this was that he loved his wife and children and was looking forward to the day he could get back to them. But when word came down from the military to Floyd Thompson's wife, she was at that time having an affair with another soldier. She made a statement that she didn't want people in the military base where she lived to know he was a prisoner, because they would look at her different. So the military, to go along with her wishes, kept it secret that he was, in fact, a POW. He was just listed as MIA for a long, long time. When they were finally released and came home, the man was devastated. His wife was living with someone else. His children was with this other person. And all the back pay he should have received over those almost 9 years being a POW, she had spent with the other guy. So he came home from being a prisoner of war for a long, long time to nothing. He did stay in the military because of the post-traumatic stress, because of alcoholism. He had a hard time in the military and died a very bitter man, and I'm not certain that anybody else going through that same thing wouldn't have the same problem. 62, another part of your baker's dozen. The rules of engagement. Now, the rules of engagement, we've talked about some before, but I'm going to go over a little bit for those who haven't seen it before. The rules of engagement is how we're supposed to fight a war. The rules of engagement during Vietnam were absolutely ridiculous. But I tell you, talk to someone who has been in the Iraqi or Afghanistan war. Their rules of engagement were even worse. The new administration is changing some of those rules now. Co-authored by fellow internationalist and Council of Foreign Relations members, Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara came up with these rules. I'm not quite certain why some of these rules were there. I guess they were worried to a certain extent about the same thing when MacArthur went into China and it started the Chinese for the second part of the Korean War. They didn't want to make sure that we didn't upset the Chinese or the Russians and get them involved, which they were already involved. The Chinese lost quite a bit of men during the Vietnam War. This rules of engagement and how it was written up was kept secret for 20 years. It took 20 years for the truth to come out. Let's talk about some of them. Here are a few. U.S. pilots were forbidden to bomb Soviet-made SAM missile sites under construction, but could risk their lives firing at them after they were operational. In other words, they wanted to make sure they didn't kill any Russians. So you couldn't, if the place was under construction, we couldn't go in and bomb it. We had to wait until the SAM missile was shot at you, and then you could go back in and bomb the base. Pilots and ground forces were not allowed to destroy communist aircraft on the ground, known as MiGs, but only those armed and dangerous in the air. In other words, if you went over and flew over a North Vietnamese air base and that MiG was on the ground, you couldn't bomb it. You had to wait till that guy got in the area because there may have been a Russian or a Chinese instructor there that you might kill. So you want to make sure you didn't kill the Russian and Chinese. You could only kill the North Vietnamese, so you couldn't bomb them. Truck depots that were 200 yards away from the main roads were forbidden targets. In other words, in North Vietnam, where they were loading supplies on these trucks to go down to Ho Chi Minh, if they were 200 yards from the main road, you couldn't bomb them. But trucks on the road, you could attack. Pilots flying over supply ships laden with war materials on the way to North Vietnam in Haiphong Harbor were ordered to look the other way. In other words, we knew those ships were full of ammunition that was going to kill American soldiers and South Vietnamese people, but we couldn't bomb them because we might make the Russians or Chinese mad. But that was okay to use those weapons. Okay. Throughout the war, returning troops total have been ordered not to shoot until shot at, not to attack the enemy's safe areas, Laos and Cambodia, not to hold the terrain that had been won at considerable cost in lives and labor. In other words, when you go in and you win this hill, after several days of fighting and losing all kinds of American and South Vietnamese troops, when you won it, well, the problem was we didn't stay there. We pulled back. The next day, the communists would come right back to where they were before. Now we got to go back in and win that hill again. A lot of frustration with American troops, a lot of considerable loss of American lives. When you look at this, there is no plan to win. There's no win strategy. This was the on-again, off-again ordering of ammunition quotas, which halted attacks and reversed victories when an elusive daily quota had been met. In other words, if you had shot up all the ammunition you're supposed to get that day, you don't get no more until tomorrow because you're on a quota. That was a new one I had never heard of before. I think that was somewhat more of the South Vietnamese, but while paradoxically abandoning the policy on other days, in other words, the next day you could shoot all you wanted to, but on yesterday you couldn't only shoot but just how many bullets you were allowed, but the next day you could shoot all you want to. There was no really set rules. It changed constantly, and you just had to know what the rules were that particular time. So we had mad minutes sometimes where you just go out there and shoot, make sure your weapons, and make sure there's nobody sneaking up on you. Okay. Quite a series of misjudgments. The Commander-in-Chief, Lyndon Baines Johnson, added one more. By one stroke of his pen, he single-handedly reversed U.S. trade policy, authorizing a wartime sale of U.S. non-military hardware to the East European Communist Bloc nations. European Communist Bloc nations who, unsurprisingly, converted the same into military hardware, which then supplied to North Vietnam, supporting labels made in the USA. Now think about it. You're out there with a soldier, you're fighting the mosquitoes, the snakes, the people, and you come across a former Viet Cong or North Vietnamese communist, and the supplies were all supplied from the United States. Kind of make you a little frustrated, maybe a little ticked off. Those made in the USA weapons kill American boys. That's a hell of a way to fight a war, isn't it, folks? That's the 60 crazy things about the war. There's a whole lot more out there. I'll be bringing you more shows. I want to talk about our next show. Our next show will be October 25th. And a lot of you out there have been watching the Ken Burns documentary. And I've watched some of it. I just haven't been able to watch all of it. I just haven't been able to sit down and look at it. But I'm going to. Our next show is going to be on the documentary. In fact, I would say there's a very good possibility our next two shows will be on that documentary. As I said up front, The whole purpose of this show is to educate the American people about the men and women who fought in Vietnam, about the Vietnam War itself. And as excited as I was for this documentary to come out, I have been watching more of the response from the academics as well as the Vietnam veterans. And there's so much stuff in the documentary, which I think was necessary at this time. It does bring out a certain amount of conversation. But my number one concern is when this is shown in class to students of the Vietnam War, it's going to be shown as the definitive information about the Vietnam War. And there's too much misinformation and left out information that I want to talk to you about. I hope to make our next program and our next two programs that would be a companion piece for people who are really interested in watching the Ken Burns special, the 10-part, 16 hours special about the Vietnam War. So when you watch it, you can watch this show and before that and kind of give you, aha, Bill said this, or such and such person that's going to be the guest on the show said that. So you find out when you watch it as a with a knowledge and informed watcher. I think it's a very important piece. It's a very good piece. I'm not certain that it could have been done much better if they had done it a 20-part series with 100 hours. I'm not certain they could have got everything, but there was enough that's missing that needs to be included. Tell all your Vietnam friends, anybody who has a comment, opinion, or suggestion or what about the Ken Burns special. Tune in to our next show, October 25th. Dial the number 919-518-9773, or even better, go on to Computers 2K Voice on Skype and give us your comments, your feelings, what you felt about the special, the documentary, what you thought was missing, what you thought was the greatest show you've ever seen. It tells a real story of Vietnam. Just be sure to be planning on coming back with us and join us and give us what you feel about the Vietnam War. It's something that we owe our children, our grandchildren, and our great children as they go back to study this Vietnam War during the tumultuous time of our entire history of the United States. We think things are problems today, but you look back at what was going on in the 60s, civil rights, voting rights, women's rights, the space race, rock and roll, change of attitudes with dress and rock and music, and there was so much going on that was just as amazing. We even made it through it. But tune in to the next show. Tell all your friends about the show so they can tune in and give us their input. And also, when someone starts talking about the Ken Burns, they can say, oops, let me tell you where you can go get the real truth from. Thank you again for tuning in tonight, and looking forward to being with you October 25th on the Vietnam veterans and the Ken Burns documentary, Vietnam. Thank you and good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.